Since 1983, men's tennis has had a very strong tradition and clear hierarchy of tournaments. 1. Grand Slam tournaments, including Wimbledon, the US Open, the French Open, and the Australian Open. 2. The Tennis Masters Cup, and 3. The Davis Cup. Before 1983, however, and in particular before the start of the Open era in 1968, the hierarchy of professional tournaments changed virtually every year. For example, in 1934, the U.S. Pro was a high-class tournament with all the best players. But just 2 years later, this tournament was ordinary because only professional teachers, no leading touring pros, entered the event. Professional tennis before the start of the Open era. Before the start of the Open era, and in addition to numerous small tournaments and head-to-head tours between the leading professionals, there were a few major professional tournaments that stood out during different periods. Some survived sporadically because of financial collapses, and others temporarily stood out when other important tournaments were not held. Bristol Cup, held at Cannes or at Beaulieu. In the 1920s, Queen's Club Pro. In 1928, International Pro Championship of Britain in Southport in the 1930s. World Pro Championships in Berlin in the 1930s. U.S. Pro Hard Court in Los Angeles, California in 1945. The only significant professional tournament that year. Philadelphia Pro 1950–1952. Pro Tournament of Champions, held in Los Angeles in 1956 and at Forest Hills thereafter, when it was not merged with the U.S. Pro. Masters Pro Round Robin in Los Angeles in 1957 and 1958. Australian Pro in 1954, 1957, and 1958. Madison Square Garden Pro in 1966 and 1967. Wimbledon Pro in 1967. There were a few team events modeled on the Davis Cup, such as the Bonnardel Cup in the 1930s and the Kramer Cup from 1961 through 1963. 3 traditional championship tournaments survived into the Open era, often having all the leading players but sometimes having very depleted fields. The most prestigious of the 3 was generally the London Indoor Professional Championship, played between 1934 and 1990 at Wembley Arena in England. It was unofficially usually considered the World Championship until 1967. The oldest of the 3 was the United States Professional Championship, played between 1927 and 1999. From 1954 through 1962, this tournament was played indoors in Cleveland and was called the World Professional Championships. The third major tournament was the French Professional Championship, played usually at Roland Garros from 1934, perhaps before, but the data are unclear, through 1968. The British and American championships continued into the Open era but soon devolved to the status of minor tournaments. Because of the instability of the professional tour, the greatest tournaments in a given year could be the 3 championship tournaments, such as in 1964, or other tournaments, such as in 1959 when the greatest tournaments probably were the Forest Hills Pro, the Masters Pro in Los Angeles, and almost all the Australian Pro tournaments. However, these 3 tournaments were considered by some tennis experts as the 3 tournaments of the professional Grand Slam, until 1967. Some years, as in 1948, only one of them was held, the U.S. Pro in this case. And even in 1944 none was organized. This explains why professionals players have less impressive records than those of the modern players, but it doesn't mean that the banished players of the pre-Open era were less great than their Open era colleagues. As with any statistics, Those of tennis players should be put into the correct context because a. They are mixing performances of the amateur circuit. Until 1967, the professional circuit. Until 1967, and the open circuit. Since 1968. B. They don't always take into account the greatest events of a given year, such as the 1959 example above. For instance, Ken Rosewall's amateur successes between 1953 and 1956 were achieved without having to compete against world-class professionals like Frank Sedgman and Pancho Gonzalez. Likewise, when Rod Laver captured the amateur Grand Slam in 1962, he did not have to face opponents such as Rosewall, Lou Hode, Pancho Segura and Andres Gimeno, all professionals, and therefore his 1962 Grand Slam is not seen as impressive as his 1969 Grand Slam, which he won in the Open era. In 1967, Laver was omnipotent on fast courts, winning all the greatest pro tournaments that year: Wimbledon Pro Grass, the U.S. Pro Grass, Wembley Pro Indoor Wood, fastest surface ever used in tennis, and the French Pro Indoor Wood. In the official statistics as published by the ITF or ATP, these tournaments are seldom listed, because only the amateur tournaments were taken into account. Yet Laver's supremacy in 1967 was undisputed. In his statistics, 19 major tournaments, 3 of the 4 previous tournaments are listed. The one tournament not chosen is 1967 Wimbledon Pro because it was a one-off event and not a Grand Slam Pro tournament, but it was probably the greatest pro event of the 60s and in particular of 1967. It indicates that the Grand Slam label in the pre-Open era is not always attributed to the greatest tournaments of a given year. In reality, to fairly compare pre-Open era players' records with Open era players, it would be necessary to select from the tennis beginnings the 4 greatest events of each year, knowing it would change every year. Some years it is difficult to choose the 4 greatest tennis events. Thus, for instance, Ken Rosewall's record of 23 victories, indicated above, would be reduced to about 21 tournaments, equivalent to the modern Grand Slam tournaments: Wembley Pro 1957, 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963 New York City Madison Square Garden Pro 1966 French Pro 1958, 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966 French Open 1968 U.S. Pro 1963, 1965 U.S. Open 1970 Australian Open 1971 WCT Finals 1971, 1972. In that list, on one hand, have disappeared all Rosewall's great amateur successes: Australia 1953, 1955 Roland Garros 1953 U.S. 1956, and also the 1972 Australian Open without 18 of the 20 best players. But on the other hand have appeared some pro tournaments which weren't one of the 3 classic ones. See Ken Rosewall's article. Most major singles titles. The 3 professional tournaments: Wembley Pro, French Pro, U.S. Pro, until 1967 are sometimes referred as the professional Grand Slam tournaments by tennis historians, such as Robert Geister. Raymond Lee, in his Greatest Player of All Time, a statistical analysis article. This table includes those major professional titles before the Open era. The top 13 are notes. A Grand Slam tournaments of the Open era are marked in bold font. B. Rosewall's wins at the Wembley Pro in 1968 and the U.S. Pro in 1971 are not included in the list of his major titles because those tournaments were not major events after the start of the Open era in April 1968. See Laver's wins at the Wembley Pro in 1969 and 1970. The U.S. Pro in 1968 and 1969, and the French Pro in 1968 are not included in the list of his major titles because those tournaments were not major events after the start of the Open era. D. Including World Hard Court Championships in 1921. Official Clay Court World Championships. E. Including World Hard Court Championships in 1922. Statistics. The draws of pro majors were significantly smaller than the traditional Grand Slam tournaments. Usually they only had 16 or even fewer professional players, though they were the top players in the world. This meant only 4 rounds of play instead of the modern 6 or 7 rounds of play. As of Wimbledon 2017. Active players in boldface. Most singles titles. As of the 4th of July 2017. Active players in boldface. Sources. ATP. Michelle Sutter. Vainqueurs winners 1946 to 2003. Paris 2003. Joe Macaulay. The History of Professional Tennis. London 2001. Robert Geist. Der Großmeister die denkwürdige Karriere des australischen Tennisspielers Kenneth Robert. Rosewall. Vienna 1999. Tony Trabert, Tennis de France magazine. ATP. John Barrett, editor. World of Tennis Yearbooks. London 1969 to 1983. Before 1972, tennis results were not automatically registered as they are now with the ITF, International Tennis Federation, and the ATP. Many have been lost and never even recorded. In particular, many professional results before 1968 have disappeared or are contradictory. For instance, Ray Bowers, who gives a very detailed account of the 1926 to 1945 pro era called History of the Pro Tennis Wars in the Tennis Server website, categorically affirms that there was no 1936 Wembley Pro Tournament and no 1938 edition too, while Macaulay lists a final result. However, the most important ones have been preserved. ATP data is far from being exhaustive. They only begin in 1968 and they omit many results until 1971, 1972 and even after. For example, there are no results of the New South Wales Championships in 1973. Mal Anderson, or in 1974. Tony Roche. Therefore, the global amounts listed here are at least equal if not superior to those of the ATP. Even the modern players as Connors, Lendl, McEnroe, Nastase, Asher Borg have more titles here. For instance, Borg won his first tournament at Helsinki in 1973 and it doesn't appear in the ATP statistics. Other remark. Michelle Sutter chose about 150 to 200 tournaments each year, including some invitation tournaments or tournaments which were at the time, before the 90s, the equivalent of the Challenger Series tournaments of today. When those tournaments appeared in the early 90s, Sutter listed them in his book. Sutter, being the main source of that part of the article. Such tournaments are counted in this list. This explains, for instance, why Federer has 4 more wins than his ATP wins number. Male tennis players with most major pro tours won before the Open era. In the years before the Open era, male professionals often played more frequently in tours than in tournaments because a head-to-head tour between 2 tennis stars was much more remunerative than a circuit of pro tournaments, and the number of professional tournaments was small. For example, Fred Perry earned U.S. $91,000 in a 1937 North American tour against Ellsworth Vines, but won only U.S. $450 for his 1938 victory at the U.S. Pro Tennis Championships. Vines probably never entered a tournament between the London Indoor Professional Championship in October 1935, which he won, and the May 1939 edition of that tournament, which he lost. In 1937, Vines played 70 matches on 2 tours and no matches in tournaments. Even in the 1950s, some professionals continued to play numerous tour matches. During his first 5 months as a professional, January through May 1957, Ken Rosewall played 76 matches on a tour against Pancho Gonzalez, but only 9 matches in tournaments. As an example of the small number of professional tournaments held before the Open era, Joe Macaulay has determined that for 1952, only 7 professional tournaments were played by the top international players, and 2 other professional tournaments, the British Pro and the German Pro, were reserved for domestic players. It was only during the 1960s that professional tournaments became more significant than tours. The prevalence of head-to-head tours and the small number of professional tournaments makes it necessary to consider the tours when comparing male players from before the Open era with male players during the Open era. The following lists the pre-Open era professionals who won the most tours based on the information currently available. Pancho Gonzalez, 7 major pro tours. January 3, 1954 – May 30, 1954. This tour was in the United States and Canada and was a series of 4-man tournaments. All formats. Eliminatory rounds with or without third-place match. Round-robin events. Except in Charlottesville, VA. January 13, where a 3-man round-robin event without Donald Budge was held. From January 3 to March 25, the players involved were Pancho Gonzalez, Pancho Segura, Frank Sedgman, and Donald Budge. In April, Carl Earn replaced Budge. In May, Earn was in his turn replaced by Bobby Riggs. There were 70 tournaments played in that tour. Gonzalez won the tour ahead of Segura and Sedgman if we consider head-to-head win-loss records and prize money won. On June 2, a report stated that Gonzalez won 29 tournaments and had an 85-40 win-loss, while Sedgman won 21 tournaments and Segura won 20 tournaments. In head-to-head meetings, the results aren't 100% sure. Gonzalez' win-loss record against Segura was about 30-21 or 30-20, and was possibly exactly equal against Sedgman, 30-21 or 30-22, and Segura would have led Sedgman by the slightest margin, 23-22. Budge won only 1 match in the tour, against Gonzalez in the first round of the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles on February 19. Earn apparently won none, and Riggs won 1 against Gonzalez on May 20 in Victoria, Canada. British Columbia, December 9, 1955 – June 3, 1956. This was a head-to-head tour in the United States against Tony Trabert. Gonzalez prevailed 74-27. January 1957 – May 1957. This was a world tour against Ken Rosewall. Gonzalez prevailed 50-26. January 1958 – May 1958. This was a world tour against Lou Hode. Gonzalez prevailed 51-36. February 20, 1959 – May 31, 1959. This was a world tour including Hode, Ashley Cooper, and Mal Anderson. Gonzalez finished with a 47-15 record. Hode was 42-20. Cooper was 21-40. And Anderson was 13-48. Gonzalez lost his series to Hode 13-15. January 1960 – June 1960. This was a world tour including Rosewall, Segura, and Alex Olmedo. Gonzalez finished with a 49-8 record. Rosewall was 32-25. Segura was 22-28. And Olmedo was 11-44. December 30th, 1960 – May 28th, 1961. This was a world tour including Gonzalez, with Segura occasionally substituting for him. Andres Gimeno. Hode, with Trabert, Cooper, and Sedgman occasionally substituting for Hode. Barry Mackay, Olmedo, and Butch Buchholz. In the first phase, Gonzalez finished with a 33-14 record, including the Segura matches. Gimeno was 27-20. Hode was 24-23, including the Trabert, Cooper, and Sedgman matches. Mackay was 22-25. Olmedo was 18-29. And Buchholz was 16-31. In the second and final phase, Gonzalez def. Gimeno 21-7. Ellsworth Vines. 5 major Pro Tours. January 10, 1934 – May 13, 1934. This was a North American tour against Bill Tilden. The results are not known definitively. However, American Lawn Tennis reported that Vines had an edge of 11-9 in the first phase of their tour from January 10 through February 16, and that Vines led Tilden by a 19-match margin after the second phase of their tour, played from March 21 through May 13. Tilden had won 17 times for the entire year, per an Associated Press report. So a probable win-loss record at tour's end on May 13 was 36-17 in Vines' favor. Slightly over 50 matches would have been played. Per Ray Bowers, Vines also dominated Henri Cachet 10-0 and Martin Plaa 8-2 in a small United States vs. France team tour in the U.S., with Tilden being Vines' teammate. January 9, 1935 – April 29, 1935. This was a North American tour including Les Stephan at first, then Hans Nusslein, with occasional matches against Tilden and George Lott. Vines led Stephan 25-1 until the latter fell ill. Thereafter, Vines beat Nusslein slightly less than 3/4 of the time. He occasionally played Tilden instead of Nusslein, as the Vines-Tilden matchup seemed to be a better draw. His final tally against Tilden on this tour was 9-3. Through March 15 his tally against Lott was 2-0. January 11, 1936 – June 7, 1936. This was a U.S. tour against Stephan, won by Vines 75-15. In October and November 1936, Vines and Tilden faced each other in an Asian tour. The final standings are also unknown, but at the end of the Japanese part of the tour, Vines led Tilden 8-1. January 6, 1937 – May 12, 1937. This was a North American tour against Fred Perry. Vines prevailed 32-29. In a small British Isles tour from May 25 through June 15. Perry defeated Vines 6-3. January 11, 1938 – May 30, 1938. This was a U.S. tour against Perry. Vines prevailed 49-35, or 48-35. In a small Caribbean tour November 15-29. The two players each won 4 matches. Jack Kramer. 4 major Pro Tours. December 26, 1947 – May 27, 1948. In this North American tour against Bobby Riggs, Kramer prevailed 69-20. October 25, 1949 May 21. 1950. In this North American tour against Pancho Gonzalez, Kramer prevailed 96-27, or 97-26. October 28. 1950 March. 1951. In this North American tour against Pancho Segura, Kramer prevailed 64-28. January 6. 1953 June 1. 1953. In this North American tour against Frank Sedgman, Kramer prevailed 54-41. Bill Tilden. 3 major Pro Tours. February 18. 1931 August 16. 1931. In this North American tour against Carol Kozelu, Tilden prevailed 50-17. Tilden, who kept close records, summarized the outcome of this tour as follows. Overall, Tilden 50, Kozelu 17. Indoors, Tilden 26, Kozelu 1. Grass, Tilden 2, Kozelu 0. Outdoor hard courts, Kozelu 5, Tilden 3. Clay, Tilden 19, Kozelu 11. Later in the autumn of 1931, the two players toured in Europe with Hans Nusslein, Martin Plaa, Albert Burke, and Frank Hunter. January 4, 1932 July, 1932. This North American tour began with 10 pros, including Tilden, Nusslein, Burke, Vincent Richards, Hunter, Roman Najuch, Alan Bear, and Emmett Pear. But by the end of January, each stop featured a Tilden-Nusslein match, preceded by a singles match between 2 other pros and followed by doubles. Beginning with Kozelu's joining of the tour in May and extending through the remainder of the tour, Tilden and Nusslein competed with the other players. Complete tour results are far from being known, but Tilden is the certain winner. As of early April 1932, Tilden led Nusslein 32 matches to 12. January 24, 1933 May, 1933. This was another North American tour between Tilden and Nusslein. Although the results are incomplete, Tilden was the winner. As of early May 1933, data from more than half their matches indicated that Tilden won 2/3 of the matches. During the summer of 1933, a European tour featured several team events organized on national lines with Tilden, Bruce Barnes, Nusslein, and other German and French players. Don Budge. 3 major Pro Tours. January 3, 1939 March 6, 1939. In this North American tour against Ellsworth Vines, Budge prevailed 22-17. From March 10 through May 8, Budge dominated Perry 28-8. In another North American tour that was less important than the previous Budge-Vines tour because Perry was second to Vines in the professional ranks, Budge also won a European tour over Vines, Bill Tilden, and Les Stephan. January 6, 1941 May 10, 1941. This was a North American tour against Tilden. Although complete tour results are not known with certainty, 49 of the matches are fully documented. In those matches, Budge prevailed 43-5 with 1 tie. The final outcome of the tour was probably 46-7 plus 1 tie. December 26, 1941 before April 5, 1942. This was a North American tour against Bobby Riggs, Frank Kovacs, Fred Perry, and Stephan. Budge finished with a 52-18 record. Riggs was 36-36. Kovacs was 25-26. Perry was 23-30. And Stephan, who played only when the others were injured or ill, was 2-28. See also Tennis tournament records and statistics. World number 1 male tennis player rankings.